Hello, I am making this video after Christmas 2020 and before 12th night, which is why we've got Christmas decorations here. But it's not going to be about the news or anything about 2020. It's going to be one of my periodic excursions into English literature. And in this instance, I am just going to go through something that's often quoted as a poem. It's a little song that turns up in Love's Labour's Lost, which is one of Shakespeare's plays, a comedy. And it's called When Icicles Hang by the Wall. It's one of the most misunderstood poems in English literature, which is why I'm going through it now, because I want to explain a few things. The problem is meanings of words have sort of slid sideways in many cases, and you don't actually understand what it's about. It's nothing earth-shattering, but it's not quite what you think it is. So I'll just read the poem to you, and then we'll go through it. When icicles hang by the wall. Well, okay, it's a poem about winter, isn't it? When icicles hang by the wall, and Dick the shepherd blows his nail, and Tom bears logs into the hall, and milk comes frozen home in pail. When blood is nipped and ways be foul, then nightly sings the staring owl, to woo, to wit, to woo, a merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. When all aloud the wind doth blow, and coughing drowns the parson's saw, and birds sit brooding in the snow, and Marian's nose looks red and raw, when roasted crabs hiss in the bowl, then nightly sings the staring owl, to woo, to wit, to woo, a merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. It's often put forward as a sort of cosy view of winter, because there's this thing about roasted crabs hissing in the bowl and greasy Joan, just standing over a steaming cauldron near the fire. But actually it isn't. Well, I mean, it is about winter. It's not a cosy poem, though. When icicles hang by the wall, well, we all know about that, and Dick the shepherd blows his nail. That was really cold then. Remember, when you don't have gloves, that's suffering. And Tom bears logs into the hall. Well, yes, so not into the cooking areas, but into the hall where the family assemble. So it's got to be cold then, because when you lit a fire, remember, it's not only a matter of burning the logs in the hall. You've got to go and get the logs first. They don't come delivered on a truck or in, sort of net bags you get at the supermarket or anything like that. So you think twice before you burn wood. And I might say it was very smoky as well, because they didn't kiln dry most of it, and a lot of it would have been actually quite fresh wood, because, as I say, you've got to, storing it is difficult. So, and you don't have tarpaulins to cover it with, so a lot of it would just get rained on anyway. So when you're lighting logs in the hall, in the hearth in the hall, there's going to be a lot of smoke and not an awful lot of heat. That's probably an act of sheer desperation, isn't it? I'm not saying it's terrible. What I am saying is it's not half so much fun as people seem to think it is. And milk comes frozen home in pail. Well, remember, when you go to milk the cow is in the barn just across the yard from your house. And milk comes out of a cow at a very warm temperature. Cow's blood heat is more than a human blood heat, so it's quite hot, and it would take real cold for the milk to freeze between it being filled into the bucket and then brought back into the house. When blood is nipped, well, again, when your fingers are going white, and ways be foul. Now, ways means roads, and foul means muddy. So it means you can't get anywhere. If you're going by cart, the cart wheels will stick in the mud, or the ruts will freeze and create terrible obstacles for you to get over if you're going by horse, which will be slipping about all over the place. So basically, you have to stay home, and just getting from A to B is something you think about twice. Then nightly sings the staring owl. Of course, there are most of the birds of any sense have gone south for the winter. So all you have is the sound of the owl. Remember that there weren't many other sounds, especially at night. The sounds of small animals, mice and things in the wainscoting, and the owl. And that would be the sound of winter. Water dripping off the roof, the occasional rustle of the rat or the mouse that's using your walls as a highway, and then outside the sound of the owl. To wit, to woo, a merry note. That's not so merry. And there's Greasy Joan, dripping sweat into a pot over the fire. Now, when all aloud the wind doth blow, all right, so, you've got this moaning of the wind, and coughing drowns the parson's saw. Now, you were legally required to go to church. So however bad the weather was, you'd have to throw on whatever cloak you had and make your way. Obviously, it would have to, most of the time, on foot to the village church, and so would the parson. And Shakespeare was somebody who really knew good writing and original thought when he came across it. And the parson, who would have been making the same sermons week after week, year after year, decade after decade, will be coming out with the same old trite things. Now, this is a saw. And he was referring to this. When you use a saw, you get that sound in the wood, don't you? That monotonous rhythmic sound. And the word saw also means a cliche. But it's taken from the idea that it's just something you repeat without even much of a thought for the meaning. And and of course churches weren't heated, so he was talking about sitting in a freezing cold church with wet muddy feet if you were lucky, and the parson just grating away triteness and cliches, and people just shuffling their feet, trying to keep warm and coughing while the parson drones on. And birds sit brooding in the snow, even they're miserable, and Marion's nose looks red and raw. And that's, you get a red nose from the cold. You're really miserable. When roasted crabs hiss in the bowl. Now, this is the most misunderstood line in a generally misunderstood poem, because he's not referring to the crustacean. You see, in the winter, in Shakespearean England, there was very little fruit available. Think about it. There was nothing on the trees. There were turnips. you had turnips, and a raw turnip is, well, I mean, it's a crunch, isn't it? But that's about, and there were winter apples. If you were quite well off, you might be able to afford oranges from time to time that had been imported from Spain. A lot of them would have arrived, in the middle of the country. In London, they would have been relatively fresh, or maybe Bristol, any of the ports. But further into the country, a lot of them would have been quite mouldy by the time people got them. And the most reliable fruit was winter apples. That is, you harvested the apples in the summer, or in the autumn rather, and then you'd lay them in boxes with straw. Each apple has to be separate so that if one rots, it doesn't start rotting the others. And then you'd lay them out, and then you'd put more straw on, and you'd lay them out some more. And if you were careful with your apples and packed them carefully and ate them carefully, you would have some sort of fresh fruit throughout the winter. But in the winter, especially say through February, you would be running out. And what you'd have left would be the apples that you least wanted to eat. You'd start off with the nicest ones, and then bit by bit through the winter, you'd be eating the less desirable ones. And the very least desirable were crab apples. I don't know how many of you have actually tried eating a crab apple, but it's the sort of thing where they're very little, they're often hard, and when you take a bite out of them, you feel like plaster of Paris has exploded inside your mouth. It's this horrible sour, dry taste that you sort of trying to smack your tongue against the roof of your mouth to move the flavour for as much as you can. Now, one of the ways of dealing with a crab apple is to put it in a bowl and warm it up so it disintegrates a little bit, goes more into sludge. If you're fairly well off, you could put a little honey in there as well to sweeten it up. But it's not really delightful to eat. It's the food of desperation and deprivation, and it's the last thing you're going to eat. So when you're down to the crab apples, it's probably if the harvest was bad, then it's in the middle of winter, and if the harvest was good, it's at the end of winter. But whatever. January and February in Britain are the worst, coldest times of the year. January is generally, just talking generally, January is when you get the snow, and February is when you get freezing rain, just going on and on forever. Anyway, so you're home and you're in front of the fire and you're trying to roast crab apples because that's all you've got in the way of fruit. Anyway, roasted crabs hissing in the bowl. So that's not as cozy an idea as it sounded to start with, is it? Then nightly sings the staring owl, to woo, to wit, to woo, a merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. So I'll read it again. Basically, now you understand the words, you understand what it's talking about. I'll just read it through, and then you've got to think what those words are. But what you've also got to think is this: whatever we say about this poem, basically, it's somebody griping about the weather. And it's just sort of comforting to know that however great Shakespeare was, he wasn't above indulging in the age-old British habit of complaining about the weather. When icicles hang by the wall, and Dick the shepherd blows his nail, and Tom bears logs into the hall, and milk comes frozen home in pail. When blood is nipped and ways be foul, then nightly sings the staring owl, to woo, to wit, to woo, a merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. When all aloud the wind doth blow, and coughing drowns the parson's saw, and birds sit brooding in the snow. And Marian's nose looks red and raw when roasted crabs hiss in the bowl. Then nightly sings the staring owl, to woo, to wit, to woo. A merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.